The 1912 Titanic disaster is one of the most famous shipwrecks in maritime history, but a freshwater disaster on the Mississippi River killed far more people than the Titanic's 1,517 deaths. Yet most Americans in the world have never heard of it. In this Learning Lodge video, we will be covering the disaster of the Sultana, the deadliest freshwater sinking in American history. We must start the story of the Sultana sinking in an even more harrowing location, the nation's most infamous Civil War prison camp, Andersonville, known as Hell on Earth. Andersonville Prison, officially known as Camp Sumter, was a Confederate prisoner of war camp located near Andersonville, Georgia, during the American Civil War. Conditions at Andersonville were horrific. The prison was originally designed to hold 10,000 Union prisoners, but at its peak it held over 32,000 men. The overcrowding, lack of shelter, poor sanitation, and inadequate food and water supplies led to widespread suffering and death among the prisoners. After the war, the commander of Andersonville, Captain Henry Witz, was arrested, tried, and convicted of war crimes. He was executed by hanging in November 1865, becoming the only Confederate officer to be executed for his war crimes. In April 1865, in an effort to get soldiers out of these squalid conditions, the North and South brokered a massive prisoner of war exchange. Nearly 40,000 Union prisoners from Andersonville and other Confederate prisons made their way to Camp Fisk near Vicksburg, Mississippi. Those who endured Andersonville had battled against insurmountable odds just to get to this point. The survivors were mere shadows of themselves, akin to walking corpses, barely clinging to life, their bodies reduced to little more than naked skeletons. Here at Camp Fisk, they faced a separate issue: transportation. How would these weary soldiers find their way home? The answer lay in the bustling port, where a remarkable scene unfolded, akin to an 1860s version of Dunkirk. Ships and captains from all walks of life lined up to carry the emancipated troops back home. These ships were not simply there on their own goodwill, however. The U.S. government had offered enticing premiums for ship captains, $5 for each enlisted man and $10 for each officer, who would undertake the crucial task of transporting the Union soldiers northward along the Mississippi River. These values are equivalent to $96 and $192 respectively, which is a fair chunk of change for a boat ride. The promise of profit drew a flood of vessels to Vicksburg, where captains wasted no time in loading their boats stern to stem with the wary passengers. Every inch of space was utilized, as these vessels became makeshift transports of hope, crammed to the very brim with ragged soldiers eager to return to their loved ones and begin the long journey to recovery. Such was the case for young Captain James Cass Mason, part owner of the massive 260-foot side-wheeler steamship named Sultana. He heard about the government offer and hastily departed from Cairo, Illinois, hell-bent for Vicksburg. The Mississippi River was experiencing one of its worst floods in history. The rolling, roaring waters were thick and churning with trees, debris, and danger. Mason was undeterred and rode the rapids downstream to Vicksburg in record time. Captain Mason faced another simple problem of supply and demand. There was a seemingly endless quantity of soldiers looking for their way north, but a steamboat had a maximum capacity of just 376. Mason, a man of opportunity, ignored this limit. He bribed the dock quartermaster and stuffed the ship with more than 2,500 prisoners of war. While in Vicksburg, the Sultana received maintenance and repair on one of its boilers, which had been damaged on the hasty trip south. What should have been a routine fix became a chaotic mess as passengers got in the way of repairs and workers. Captain Mason is alleged to have agreed to a good enough fix, as he worried had he waited to fix the boiler as it required, the Union soldiers would find alternate passage northward. Before the ship left port, a photographer, shocked by the number of passengers crammed on the ship, asked the captain for permission to take a photograph of the brimming humanity. As word spread throughout the ship that a photograph was being taken, men ran to the aft dock to be in the photograph, and the ship lurched and nearly capsized. The captain ordered the men to remain in their places and not move, knowing full well how dangerously overloaded the ship was. The photo you see here would be the last photograph of many of these men. On April 24, 1865, the Sultana departed from Vicksburg northward. Aboard her overcrowded decks were some 1,960 paroled prisoners, 22 guards from the 58th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, 70 paying cabin members, and 85 crew members. At approximately 2 a.m. on April 27th, 7 miles from Memphis, disaster struck as one of the Sultana's boilers exploded. The force was like a volcano exploding in the middle of the ship. Spewing boiling water and fire quickly engulfed the entire boat. The heat was so terrible, the water boiled as the ships burned. Because the boat had been so packed, many of the passengers were crammed right by the boilers. The explosion instantly killed hundreds, mostly soldiers from Kentucky and Tennessee. Hundreds more were immediately burned, battered, or broken. Philip Horn was on the top deck and writes of being awoken by the explosion.
While this was going on, I fell asleep. After that, I knew but little and seemed to live 1,000 years in a minute. My first conception or self-identification was that I was lost in the air, and true it was. I was whirled in the air. I was either blown through the stairway or thrust out sidewise into the river, but my first consciousness was that of being in the air. When I struck the water, I went down twice, when, upon rising the second time, I encountered a piece of the wreck which I seized.
Those not immediately killed or incapacitated by the explosion had to deal with a raging fire taking over the ship. Otto Barden led a group of passengers to the top deck and then had to leap from the ship to avoid the flames. He writes,
I tried to get a large plank, but this was too heavy, so I left it and got a small board. I started towards the wheel to jump into the water, where a young man said to me, "You jump first, I cannot swim." This man had all of his clothes on, and I had just my shirt and pants on. I said to him, "You must paddle your own canoe, I can't help you." Then I jumped and stuck to my board.
In less than 20 minutes, most of the ship was engulfed in flames. The explosion ripped the port wheelhouse from the main body of the ship, but drug in the water, causing the boat to spin, which fanned the flames towards the bow, consuming the last refuge from the fire. Those who made it off the ship were not necessarily safe either. They had to deal with a roaring river which drowned many of the feeble prisoners. If they could swim to shore, many still had to wait until the next afternoon to be saved, which many of the injured simply could not survive. As the Sultana burned, the nearby city of Marion, deep in southern Confederate territory, began a chaotic rescue mission to save the soldiers on board. The citizens of Marion did what they could, hitching together rafts and floating out to gather survivors. Many of these men were Confederate soldiers who just weeks ago would have been trying to kill the very men they were saving. But now, in a time of disaster, there was no more room for hate. One of the most inspiring of these stories is from Franklin Hardin Barton, who served in the 23rd Arkansas Cavalry, where he was tasked with, amongst other things, raiding ships going up and down the river. A few weeks earlier, he might have been attacking the Sultana if it had come in. Instead, newspaper accounts say Franklin Barton saved several Union soldiers. The exact death toll was never known, but most estimates place deaths at far more than 1,800, from drowning to being boiled to burned to death. However, today, the Sultana disaster is mostly forgotten. Some say this is because the government was trying to hide its negligence. Others say it points to a greater conspiracy with Confederate saboteurs. In my eyes, the Sultana disaster is a dark stain at the end of the American Civil War, but one overshadowed by an even bigger event just weeks before, the assassination of President Lincoln. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. If you know someone who might enjoy this video, feel free to send it their way. Hope you enjoyed, and please click back soon.